Why are you the beneficiary of the insurance money? Ken was my husband, and this money should be entirely mine.
The shrill ringing of the phone in the middle of the night woke me from my sleep. Who could be calling at this hour? With a sense of foreboding tightening my chest, I reached out with trembling hands to pick up the receiver. What I heard was the voice of my daughter-in-law, Mary, a tone I had never heard before. Just a few hours earlier, she had smiled gently and said, "Let me take care of the preparations for the third-month memorial, Mom." But now, her voice was cold and filled with hatred. I could hear her ragged breathing and an unfamiliar low, warped voice coming from the receiver, freezing me in place.
The past 3 months, pretending to be the perfect daughter-in-law in front of you made me sick.
Her harsh words cut through my heart. The days we shared the sorrow of losing my son and supported each other, were they all just an act? Every day I never let the incense burn out, and I always put my hands together at my son's altar. Watching me, she must have been laughing at me in her heart.
I need this money to pay off my debt. Without it, I'm done for.
A loud crash of porcelain shattering echoed in my ears. It must have been one of my son's favorite bowls or vases that she threw. My chest tightened. I managed to force out words, my voice shaking. But Ken made this decision.
Enough! Come to the insurance office tomorrow. We're going to rewrite the documents.
Taking away even the last piece of my son, which I spoke to every morning, was unthinkable. It was the only thing keeping me going, the one connection I had. To think she'd even take that away, erasing my son's existence completely. How could she be so cruel? Just before hanging up, Mary spoke in a voice as cold as ice, one I had never heard before.
This is all your fault. I will never forgive you.
The line clicked, and something deep within me shattered. Even when I lost my husband in an accident, I hadn't felt this torn apart. I glanced at the framed photo of my son on the living room shelf, his gentle smile seeming to meet my eyes. "I'm so sorry, Ken. I can't do anything." As those words slipped out, the doorbell suddenly rang. My name is Emily Easton. I'm 58 years old and retired, but I used to be a high school science teacher. I taught biology and chemistry, subjects I was passionate about, and being a science teacher was always my dream. My only son, Ken, shared my love for science from a young age. I bought him a microscope when he was in elementary school, and we learned about the wonders of biology together. Ken would often lie on the floor flipping through my old college biology textbooks and science encyclopedias, saying he wanted to be a researcher when he grew up. He went on to major in science at university and eventually secured a job at a pharmaceutical company as a researcher. Getting a research position in the pharmaceutical field isn't something one achieves easily. It requires tremendous effort and academic dedication. My husband and I felt a sense of relief and pride when Ken landed his dream job, seeing him work passionately. We shared joy over Ken's bright future, but my husband passed away 5 years ago. Ken, who always said he wanted to help people with the medicines he developed, struggled to come to terms with his father's death, often lamenting that he should have been more capable. Despite being just the two of us, we managed to support each other and move forward. One morning on my birthday, the phone rang and I quickly answered it. It was Ken.
"Mom, it's your birthday today, right? I'll come home early."
Although Ken lived far away, he always made the effort to visit and spend my birthday together, just the two of us. Last year when I opened the door, he stood there holding a bouquet of white roses and flowers for his father's altar, smiling and saying, "Happy birthday, Mom." Living alone, I rarely bought cake for myself, but Ken brought an entire cake with a message plate that said, "Happy birthday, Emily." I joked, I'm too old to be excited about a cake plate, but I was so happy that I kept that picture of us, smiling with the cake, as my phone's wallpaper for a whole year. Ken's smile in that photo was the best gift I could have received that year. I was grateful from the bottom of my heart for having such a kind son. But Ken can no longer celebrate my birthday or take pictures with me, smiling and making peace signs. A year ago, Ken called me to say he has someone he wanted to introduce. I was so excited, thinking it might be a formal marriage introduction, that I began preparing a feast of Ken's favorite dishes that barely fit on the table to welcome them.
"We're here, Mom."
The woman who quietly followed Ken into the house had a calm demeanor and greeted me politely.
"Hello, my name is Mary. It's nice to meet you."
She stood with perfect posture and had a beautiful smile.
"She supported me during my hardest times when I was feeling down after Dad's death. I'm thinking of marrying her."
They looked at each other and smiled, a sight that filled me with joy and pride. After my husband passed away, Ken rarely smiled, feeling the weight of losing his beloved father and perhaps his own inadequacies. I was grateful that Mary had been there to help him through that dark period. I genuinely wished for them to build a happy life together. They moved into an apartment not far from me after getting married. Neither Ken nor Mary seemed to have extravagant tastes, and they spent their weekends reading or cooking, enjoying a simple life. It made me feel at ease knowing they shared that similarity. I also loved reading scientific literature and articles about biology in my spare time. I never felt the need to interfere with them, thinking it would be best for us to live our lives at our own pace. However, the two of them started visiting me monthly, bringing Ken's favorite snacks and Mary's homemade treats. At first, I would receive the offerings and place them on my husband's altar myself, but eventually Mary started asking, "Is this the right dish for Dad?" and would place them there herself. Her cheerful personality lit up the house, and soon I found myself eagerly anticipating their visits. But at some point, Ken began to mention feeling unwell.
Is it your stomach again? You left your food halfway the other day, remember?
Maybe it's best to see a doctor.
Yeah, maybe after things calm down at work.
Around this time, Ken seemed thinner, more worn out. He had dark circles under his eyes and looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. During conversations, he sometimes seemed distant, not fully listening or responding off topic. When it came to work, he seemed emotional, almost defeated. It was clear that the pressure from his boss was weighing heavily on him. That day, Ken barely touched the meal I prepared, spoke little, and left early. I worried, but I reassured myself that Mary was there to support him and tried not to overthink it. A few days later, the phone rang. It was Ken.
Mom, I'm sorry, but did you see my wristwatch when I visited?
Your wristwatch? The one that belonged to your father, right? Ken cherished the expensive wristwatch that his father had loved, even though my husband wasn't usually interested in luxury items. He had bought it because he loved the idea that it could last for decades, even centuries. I remembered how he told Ken,
"If I ever stop wearing it, it's yours."
That's why Ken was the first to take it after his father's passing. Despite searching everywhere in the house, I couldn't find it.
I haven't taken off at work or anywhere, so I thought maybe you had it, Mom.
Hearing his disappointed voice, I promised to call him if I found it. Ken searched the entire house with Mary, but they couldn't find it either. It was unimaginable that he'd lose something so precious. But this was just the beginning. After that day, Ken began calling more frequently about missing items.
Mom, did you see my tablet?
A tablet? I don't remember you bringing one over.
I don't remember either, but it's missing from both work and home.
I began to wonder if it was simple forgetfulness or if someone was stealing. With a mother's instinct, I finally asked, "Ken, you seem different lately. Is something going on?" People sometimes misplace things when they're stressed or distracted. I chose my words carefully, trying not to hurt Ken's pride. After a long pause, Ken finally opened up.
It's my boss. The pressure is getting to me and I can't sleep. But I'm partially to blame too.
At first, he was calm about it, but over time, Ken began speaking more critically about his boss.
The department head nitpicks every little thing, making it impossible to work comfortably.
For someone like Ken, who always approached work with a positive and steady mindset, this meant it must have been severe. Maybe it's time to consider switching jobs. With your skills and achievements, you could find a position anywhere. I tried to offer advice, but Ken's responses remained vague and uncommitted. He seemed so far removed from his usual determined self. I felt helpless. My worries deepened, but I could think of no solutions. One day I found myself praying at my husband's altar, whispering, "What should I do?" Remembering how my husband was soaked in hot baths when troubled, I decided to take Ken on a short trip for relaxation. I booked a nearby, well-regarded inn for a change of scenery. After we arrived, we relaxed, but as I returned to our room, I noticed a couple in the lobby. The closer I got, the more familiar the woman looked. To my shock, it was Mary, dressed in brand-name clothes and sparkling jewelry, with an older man beside her. He had his arm around her waist, speaking to her, but I couldn't see her expression. Just as I was about to call out, they stepped into the elevator and were gone. I returned to my room with a sinking feeling, hoping I was mistaken. But deep down, I knew it was her. The trip did little to lift my spirits. Not long after, Ken told me he was being transferred. Although relieved he'd be away from his difficult boss, I was stunned by what he said next.
Mom, I'm being sent overseas for 6 months, starting next month.
It was clear from his voice that this transfer wasn't something he wanted.
Helping people worldwide with medicine is my mission. This overseas research will eventually benefit me too. I think I'll be back in time to celebrate your birthday, so just wait for me, okay?
Ken spoke with a forced smile before boarding the plane. I knew he must have been worried leading up to his departure. I felt relieved that he was looking ahead, even if only a little. However, soon after, all communication from Ken ceased. International calls went unanswered, and messages received no replies. Fear gripped me as I thought something might have happened to him. I decided to visit Mary at the apartment where she lived alone. I figured Mary must have been in touch with Ken. But when I rang the doorbell, no one answered for days. Finally, after several visits, Mary opened the door looking tired and uninterested. "Mary, since Ken left, I haven't heard from him. Is he alright?"
I'm sure he's fine. Don't worry about it.
Her response was cold, indifferent, as if my concern was a nuisance. "Have you been in touch with him?"
Yes, so there's no need for unnecessary worry.
Her answer, devoid of empathy, left me speechless.
Is that all? I have to go out now.
Without waiting for my reply, she shut the door. It was as if the kind, warm Mary I knew had been replaced by a stranger. Her sudden change only deepened my anxiety about Ken. The fact that Mary was receiving contact from Ken while I wasn't made no sense. Ken loved his mother dearly. There was no way he wouldn't reach out if he could. Every time I asked, Mary claimed she hadn't heard from him, and eventually she stopped answering the door altogether. I considered reaching out to the pharmaceutical company, but was deterred by Mary's warning.
Don't you understand that calling the company will only put Ken in trouble? I told you he's in touch with me. Just because he's not contacting you doesn't mean you should cause trouble. Are you trying to make the company tell him to call his mother? You're just jealous, aren't you?
Her sharp words struck a nerve. Maybe I was acting selfishly. I'm sorry, Mary. You're right. I'll wait for him to contact me. I walked home slowly, replaying her words in my mind. Was it really just jealousy? Perhaps I was overreacting. As Mary suggested, I decided to wait. Then one day, out of nowhere, Mary called me.
Emily, I have news. Ken was in an accident overseas and has passed away.
The shock rendered me speechless. I kept asking for confirmation, hoping it wasn't true, but her answer never changed. Through my tears and denial, Mary recounted what happened. Ken was in a taxi with local employees when an argument broke out between the driver and the workers. Ken, being responsible, tried to mediate but was taken away, and his body was found the next day. It was just like Ken to try to help others, even in his last moments. He became a researcher to save lives, and that's how he spent his final hours. But the loss of Ken left a void that could never be filled. My world lost all color. Mary kept me updated with daily calls and managed everything relegated to Ken's return and arrangements. She flew overseas to handle the paperwork, returning with Ken's ashes, cradling them tightly. Thank you for bringing Ken home. Tears rolled down as I gazed at the urn, unable to comprehend why Ken had to go through this. There were so many questions, but I first thanked Mary for bringing him back and discussed the future.
The local coordinator handled all the formalities. Now if anything else arises, I'll be informed.
Thank you. Please keep me updated. Mary's initially formal tone softened as she said, "Let me do whatever I can for you." Even though she was grieving too, Mary stood by me with compassion. Her strength was a beacon for me as I struggled with my own grief. When I lost my husband, I was paralyzed by the pain. Now, losing Ken, I felt the same, but Mary's support was a lifeline. She called every day, checking on me, until one day, the calls suddenly stopped. Weeks passed without a word from Mary. Then one morning, the phone rang, jolting me from my tear-soaked sleep.
Emily, what is the meaning of this?
Her sudden, angry voice shocked me. What's wrong, Mary?
I was checking the paperwork at the insurance company to process Ken's policy, and I found out that you are the sole beneficiary.
Insurance? I don't know anything about that. Ken never mentioned it to me.
Oh, that's impossible. Right after we got married, I made sure I was the beneficiary. But now it's all under your name.
I'm sorry, but I don't know why it was changed. Maybe Ken did it himself for a reason. Mary's voice trembled with frustration, muttering things like, "This is ridiculous, and how could this happen?" Mary, are you okay? After a pause, Mary spoke in a calm yet chilling voice.
I need that money. I'm in deep financial trouble, and Ken's insurance payout is the only way out.
What happened, Mary? Tell me everything. She hesitated, then sighed heavily and began.
I made some bad investments and now have an enormous debt. So large I could never repay it even if I worked my entire life. If I don't get the insurance money, I'll have to sell the apartment.
I'm sorry, but if Ken changed the beneficiary to me, he must have had a reason. I can't simply hand over all the money. The tone of the conversation shifted drastically.
Excuse me? I am Ken's wife. Legally, you're just a stranger now. How could he change the beneficiary without telling me? Did you make him do it?
I never thought the conversation would turn so aggressive over money. I had believed that Mary, like me, was drowning in grief, but the person on the phone felt different, driven by desperation and resentment. I'm sorry, but I don't know anything more about this insurance matter. I ended the call and sat frozen, holding the phone, processing everything. Moments later, the phone rang again. I picked it up, hesitantly.
I'm so sorry to bother you. This is Mary's mother.
It was the first time we had spoken since Ken and Mary's wedding.
I'm so deeply sorry for what has happened to Ken. My heart goes out to you. I just learned about Ken's passing recently, and there's something you need to know about Mary.
She explained that she hadn't heard from Mary in months.
When Mary first reached out for help with her debts, we lent her everything we could, but it wasn't enough.
I couldn't believe it. Mary had poured almost all of her resources into investments. That went south, losing nearly everything and going into debt. She even sold Ken's beloved watch and other valuables to repay parts of her debt. The realization that Ken's cherished mementos, especially his father's watch, were gone for money was heartbreaking. I remembered Ken searching desperately for the watch, and now I knew why.
Ken didn't know what she was doing. He refused to be involved in her schemes. If only she had talked to Ken and faced the debt together, things might have turned out differently.
Thank you for telling me this. I shared a part of my recent conversation with Mary's mother, mentioning how Mary had brought Ken back and kept me informed. But when it came to the insurance money, she became unrecognizably emotional. Mary's mother began to cry.
I'm so sorry. We couldn't stop her, and she has caused so much trouble for everyone, including you. We've decided to cut ties with her. You don't need to support her any longer.
She ended the call, her voice filled with sorrow. I had hoped Mary and I could share our grief and help each other through the pain of losing Ken. But it seemed that for Mary, the loss of the insurance money was greater than the loss of Ken himself. From that point on, I resolved to stay firm. If she ever called again about the insurance, I would stand my ground. But no call came. Mary disappeared from my life. 3 years passed since Ken's death. When my husband died, Ken was there to help me cope, but now I had no one. The days of grieving stretched endlessly, with nothing to pull me out. Each year as my birthday approached, I remembered all the happy moments Ken and I shared, and tears would fall. Ken, who wasn't great at surprises, would always ask me odd questions like my shoe size or my clothing size before my birthday. One year he gifted me pastel-colored pumps, and another year a high-quality silk blouse. Pretending not to know why he was asking and then acting surprised when he presented his gift became a little tradition between us. Ken's awkward but heartfelt efforts to bring me joy were what I cherished most. This year, of course, there would be no phone calls from him. On the day of my birthday, I spent it alone. As the clock approached midnight, I thought I felt Ken's presence nearby, but I dismissed it as wishful thinking and crawled into bed. The white roses he had given me last year were dried and displayed in my bedroom. Looking at them, I remembered his shy smile, and tears welled up again. Just as the clock struck 1 a.m., the doorbell rang. Who could it be at this hour? I walked cautiously to the front door, peering through the frosted glass, but unable to see who was there. I turned on the porch light and called out, "Who is it?" I kept my voice steady, trying to hide my fear.
Sorry for being so late. Happy birthday, Mom.
I could see a man holding a bouquet of white flowers. Was I hallucinating? Hearing things? But whether it was a dream, a ghost, or an illusion, I wanted to see Ken. I hurriedly unlocked the door and swung it open. There, standing before me, was Ken, looking just as he did 3 years ago.
Mom, I'm home.
Shock and joy overwhelmed me as I wrapped my arms around him, tears streaming down my face. The son I thought I would never see again was right there in front of me, alive.
I'm sorry for making you worry so much, but I kept my promise to come home for your birthday.
I ushered him inside, hands shaking, and made us some warm tea. As he sat down, Ken began to tell me the story of everything that had happened.
You knew I was having issues with my boss, right? Well, it turns out that my boss, James, was behind everything.
What do you mean? I don't understand at all. Ken explained that Mary's finance company had been involved in illegal dealings with James. James funneled unauthorized research funds under the guise of investments, and Mary, desperate for money after her failed investments, was drawn in.
She confided in James, telling him all about her debt and struggles. He pretended to sympathize and lent her money, but it came with strings attached.
Ken revealed that he had begun to suspect Mary when he noticed her leaving the house in flashy clothing and jewelry. He placed a recording device in her bag and discovered her secret meetings with James.
I heard them talking. Here, listen.
Ken pressed play on a small recorder, and the room filled with their voices.
How's his health?
It's not getting better. He's getting worse despite the new medication you gave him.
Make sure he takes this week's dose in front of you. We need to keep up appearances.
What if it doesn't work? What if it makes him sicker?
You know what happens? You handed him over in exchange for erasing your debts. We're not even close to being square.
Yes, I understand. Even if it costs him his life, I'll still get the insurance money. That should cover the debt.
Ken clenched his fists as the recording ended.
I realized then that James had been using me as a test subject for experimental drugs, and Mary knew.
Ken had immediately contacted the insurance company and changed the beneficiary to ensure Mary wouldn't profit from his potential death. He cut off contact with everyone, including me, to protect us from James's network. I told Ken that all I wanted was some sign that he was alive.
I know, Mom, but these people are ruthless. If they thought you knew anything, they wouldn't hesitate to act. They don't see people as human beings, just obstacles. If they thought you were involved, you could have disappeared overnight.
He shuddered slightly as he spoke, and I realized the kind of power and reach these people had.
After I faked my death, I worked with a local pharmaceutical company and a coordinator to collect evidence. Pretending to be dead was the only way to move freely and safely.
Ken told me he had resolved to expose James's crimes, spending years gathering information and evidence.
Compared to the US, overseas pharmaceutical companies have more resources, better research, and larger networks. I found out what James had been working on almost immediately.
What kind of drug was it?
It was a drug meant to influence life-sustaining functions, with effects that varied drastically depending on the dosage and frequency. It could yield great benefits, but also terrible consequences. The effects were unpredictable, which made it something that should never have passed regulatory standards. But James was obsessed with completing it, using funds from various investors.
The drug was designed to leave no trace in the body and required continuous consumption to show effects, making it dangerous and unsuitable for legitimate use.
He wanted to test it on as many people as possible without drawing attention, so he used people who were desperate or unaware.
Ken explained how James orchestrated illegal clinical trials, paying off those who participated and ensuring silence with money. Some participants benefited and praised the free health boost, while others suffered, but money kept them quiet.
As I investigated further, I found that multiple deaths had been covered up, and that human experimentation was rampant. It was worse than I imagined.
Over time, Ken managed to link James's dealings to an international illegal drug network. It took him 3 years to gather sufficient evidence.
I'm sorry for making you wait and worry for so long, Mom.
His voice cracked as he bowed his head, shaking with emotion. Seeing Ken's pain, I felt how hard it must have been for him, alone in a foreign land. We sat together in silence, tears flowing, until he calmed down.
I'm okay now. Let me continue.
Ken wiped his eyes and took a deep breath.
The coordinator told me that James and his associates were aware something was up. They might have targeted me when I re-entered the country. That's why I timed my return to your birthday. I thought Dad would be watching from above, looking out for us.
Ken's voice held a hint of his scientific, logical thinking mixed with the hope that his late father was still guiding him. I believe he did. Ken, if anything had happened to you, I could never celebrate my birthday again. We shared a bittersweet laugh, the tension breaking for just a moment.
Now I need to meet with the police and hand over all the evidence. This case is too big to stay quiet, so I'll send out a report to media outlets as well. It needs international attention.
Of course, but first let's eat. You haven't had a proper meal in years.
Yes, and a hot bath sounds good too. I need to unwind tonight.
As Ken disappeared into the bathroom, I moved to the kitchen. It had been so long since I prepared a meal for someone other than myself. That night, Ken and I sat at the table sharing food and stories until the sun began to rise. A few weeks later, the world exploded with the discussions about the fine line between legal and illegal drugs. Ken's whistleblowing came at the perfect moment when public interest in pharmaceutical ethics was at its peak due to a celebrity drug scandal. James's case became a nationwide scandal highlighted in news reports and documentaries.
Mr. James, is it true you collaborated with international organizations to produce illegal drugs? Silence! This is nonsense. If you have proof, show it. I've been in charge of the pharmaceutical division for years, protecting lives. This is slander.
At first, James denied everything, boasting and threatening lawsuits on camera, but Ken's meticulously gathered evidence was irrefutable. The police verified every detail leading to James's indictment. The trials revealed the horrific truth behind the legal drug trials, human experimentation, and cover-ups. James's actions were reported internationally, tarnishing the reputation of American pharmaceutical companies. After multiple charges were read in court, James admitted his guilt, leading to a sentence of 30 years in prison. Those who had collaborated with him, both inside and outside the company, were arrested, and no one stood by James in court. Ken's efforts had exposed a deep web of corruption, restoring some justice to those who had suffered. Months after the final verdict, Ken was back to his work, now leading a project focused on helping victims of similar abuses. Ken's determination to help those in need earned him recognition in the international pharmaceutical community. His story inspired young scientists who dreamed of following in his footsteps. Each month, Ken visited me wearing the wristwatch that had once belonged to his father. It gleamed on his wrist as a reminder of our family's resilience. One day after he had settled back into life in the US, I surprised him with a special gift. I found a watch just like Dad's. I wanted you to have a spare just in case. Ken's eyes widened, glistening with tears as he took the watch.
Thank you, Mom. You have no idea how much this means to me. Wearing this feels like I'm showing Dad that I'm helping people, just like he always wanted.
The moment was emotional, as if the watch symbolized both the past and the hope for the future. The ordeal brought Ken and me even closer, strengthening the bond we shared. I looked at the family altar, where my husband's photo seemed to smile back at me. I clasped my hand together in front of the altar. Please, keep watching over Ken, just as you always have. With Ken back and justice served, I finally felt peace return to my life. I eagerly looked forward to every day, knowing my son was safe and thriving. Life was slowly, steadily returning to a place where hope could flourish again.